Hey guys, really quickly, today I wanted to do a PowerPoint for you that talks about interview and talk show programs. And I believe this is the week that you guys are supposed to be doing an interview program. The goal here is just some best practices and also to talk about sort of the process of how a talk show works, how to get a guest on the air. I'm gonna talk about just interview and talk programs in general, but also hopefully some of this information will be helpful for you in your programs. Okay, so effective interviewing. Okay, the first thing that you need to know when you begin preparing for an interview is that you should prepare what your topic is going to be and the questions that you're going to be asking in advance of the interview. Okay. And that might seem obvious to some of you, but some of you might be thinking like, oh, okay, like that's good to know, because I think sometimes we think an interview should be fresh. And so you don't want to over prepare for it. And that's not the case at all. You, the interviewer, want to be as prepared as possible. Okay. So when you are preparing for your interview, as you're preparing for it, you're going to be probably thinking about the topics you'll be talking about and maybe the order of the questions that you want to ask. And something to keep in mind in the back of your head as you're preparing is you want to avoid having an overly abstract interview, okay? And so there's something called an abstraction ladder that we recommend students use and people who interview people use as you structure your interview. Okay, and what is an abstraction ladder? Okay, well, imagine a ladder that is leading you up to some point. Okay, and each rung of the ladder is slowly getting smaller as you get to your point. Okay, so it's almost like a triangle. And what you want to do is you want to start with a more abstract topic and then slowly lead your interviewee along this abstraction ladder. And you want to slowly get more and more to the point. Okay, so a 5-minute long interview will at the most have 2 topics, right? And you want to start with a broader topic and then narrow down to a more specific topic. Or within a topic, you want to start with a broader understanding and context of the topic and then slowly narrow your topic down, okay? And obviously, as you're preparing for your interview, you don't always get a choice of who you're going to interview, okay? And as a result, it's important that you try and avoid bias, okay? Because obviously for class right now, you hand-selected the person that you're interviewing. But imagine you're a reporter and you're sent out to interview a person who's committed a crime, and the crime is particularly heinous, and it's a crime that you are particularly offended by, right? For example, imagine if you were the person that was sent out and put in charge of interviewing Brock Turner, okay? He was a swimmer, a competitive swimmer who went to Stanford, and then he allegedly raped a young woman on the Stanford campus, and he went to trial, and they showed that he did in fact commit the rape, but then he was sentenced to a very mild sentence at the end of it. And so, now imagine it's a year, 5 years later, and you are asked by your news station to go and interview Brock Turner. And now you have to rehash this fairly horrible crime that he committed, that he basically didn't have to serve any time for, right? It's hard, and you can probably even tell that I am coming across as somewhat biased just talking about it, right? But if I was to sit down and interview Brock Turner, as a reporter, it would be my duty to remove bias from my questions and from my interview, okay? I'm simply here as a conduit of information, okay? I am conducting information from Brock Turner to my audience, okay? And as a responsible interviewer, you have an obligation to only ask further questions, right? So if your interviewee says something, you can dig deeper into what they said. You can ask further questions about what they said, but you can't give them, a question that is obviously rooted in bias. Okay. So do your research about your guest. Review your press kit. Pick an interesting topic. Limit the number of topics. Do not submit questions in advance. Write out or prep your introduction and conclusion, and prepare questions to start and to fill out awkward gaps in the interview. So what does all of this mean? Well, imagine you are a talk show host. You are John Oliver or Jimmy Kimmel or Conan O'Brien, whatever, okay? And you are getting ready for a month of interview guests, okay? Some guests are going to be on your show because you or somebody on your staff heard about something that you thought was cool, and now you are trying to get that person to be on your show because you want to interview them about the cool thing that you learned about, right? So maybe right now a lot of people are trying to get Carol Baskin on their show because she is culturally relevant, right? And so you, as the head of the show, because you are Jimmy Kimmel or Conan O'Brien, you might not necessarily be the person who actually came up with the idea to interview someone, right? Like, for example, maybe you're Jimmy Kimmel and you've never heard of Carol Baskin, but somebody on your staff has. And so they are trying to get Carol Baskin on your show. She agrees, but you don't know anything about her, right? Imagine a world where that was true, right? So the first thing you're going to want to do is do your research, right? Currently, doing your research on Carol Baskin might include watching an entire documentary series about her. But, there are also probably books. You'd need to look at her websites. You'd need to look at her social media. You would need to basically learn as much as possible about her. Why? Well, here's the thing, right? You're conducting an interview, and most likely there are two types of fans that are tuning in to watch your interview. There are your fans that are interested in what you are talking about, and there are her fans, and they are interested in what she is talking about, okay? Your fans need some context about who this person is, maybe. Her fans do not, right? But you need to service both groups of people during your interview, okay? So we go back to the abstraction ladder, right? You need to do as much research as possible so that you are as knowledgeable as her fans would be about her, right? But you want to start your interview on something that is going to be considered a broad topic, and then slowly narrow down your focus to the key question, which is, did you or did you not feed your ex-husband to your tigers, right? So you're not going to want to start with that question, but you are going to want to start by asking, well, how much meat does a tiger typically eat within a day? Well, how strong are their jaws, right? So you want to start off with some very general questions as you slowly build towards a point, right? And those general questions need to simultaneously not be boring for her fans and not be over your fans' heads. Does that make sense? So you are servicing both a extremely knowledgeable and potentially an extremely unknowledgeable group of people about a topic, right? Somebody who is a higher profile, probably not Carol Baskin, but let's say Angelina Jolie or Matthew Perry or any A-list celebrity, right? They're going to have a press kit that they will send out. Press kits come in a few different situations, okay? So one is, I'm Matthew Perry, and I have a Friends special that is going to be airing in, September, and so I am doing a press tour where I go on a bunch of different talk shows to talk about this new one episode special of Friends getting back together. to generate buzz to get people to tune in when that show inevitably happens, right? And my press kit is basically going to say that all I really want to talk about is that topic, right? And there might be some wiggle room, and you can probably ask me some questions outside of that topic, but I'm going to try and redirect it to this topic because this is the only reason why I'm going on your show, okay? A press kit might include information that a celebrity is not comfortable talking about, right? So, for example, when Britney Spears lost it in 2007, shaved her head, and hit people with an umbrella or whatever in a parking lot, right? For several years later, and possibly even up to now, when Britney Spears goes on a talk show to talk about something, her press kit is probably going to include that she is not comfortable talking about the year 2007 and would really appreciate it if it does not get brought up. There have been examples of celebrities flat out standing up and walking out of interviews during an interview because something that was explicitly mentioned as a no-go in their press kit got mentioned, okay? So it is important to review your press kit because it informs you on what the topic for your interview might be, and it informs you on what might be comfortable and not comfortable for your guest to talk about, okay? Obviously, you want to pick an interesting topic, right? But interesting is relative, right? And so if you are an audio file and you really want to talk about a very niche subject with your guest, but both your audience and any audience members that are joining because they're fans of your guest might also probably be audio files who are into hearing about this very niche topic, right? Whereas if you're Conan O'Brien, you're going to want to keep your topic pretty general so you can get as wide swath of audience as possible, right? Given a time limit, you want to limit the number of topics. So there are some people that you can talk to for hours and hours and hours, and that's fantastic. And maybe out of those hours and hours and hours of conversation, there might be 10 minutes of interesting interview questions, right? But we don't always benefit from having the hours and hours and hours to record. And so you really need to try and focus your attention to one specific or two specific topics given your time limit, just to make sure that your audience gets something interesting from that brief amount of time that you have your guest on your show, okay? So if you have 5 minutes, you're looking at one topic. If you have 10 minutes, you're looking at 1.5 topics. If you're looking at 30 minutes to an hour, now you're looking at something more like 3, maybe 5 topics, right? And the topics might be different levels of interest, right? So you might have a couple of smaller topics that don't take up a lot of time, and then you might have some that are bigger topics that will take up more time. If you're confused right now and you would like some clarification on picking interesting topics, limiting the number of topics, and doing your research about your guest, stop this lecture, go and watch a couple of episodes of Inside the Actors Studio with James Lipton online. James Lipton, may he rest in peace, was the best interviewer out there that is an easily accessible interview program, okay? Some of his interview guests were mega celebrities, and some of his interview guests were not mega celebrities, and they were people who were far less interesting. But he made every single interview interesting, unique, emotional, deep, and, you know, that is its own skill and its own talent. And you'll see that in an hour-long interview with James Lipton, he typically has a consistent number of topics that he touches on, starting with history about the guest, talking about the career of the guest, talking about maybe some sort of public interest piece about the guest, whether it's some sort of trauma that they went through or something that they went through in their childhood. And then, you know, talking about maybe some of the cooler projects that the guest worked on, and then finally finishing off with what's next for the guest, okay? So if you've never seen an episode of Inside the Actors Studio with James Lipton and you are interested in being interested in being on camera talent, I do highly recommend that you go and spend some time looking at some of the interviews that he did. And chances are he has probably interviewed someone that you will find interesting. So there is something for everybody in that show, okay? Do not submit your questions in advance. The reason for that is twofold. One, if you submit your questions in advance, you're giving your interviewee an opportunity to tell you that they're not going to answer some of your questions. And that sucks. You shouldn't really be asking questions that your guests aren't comfortable answering. But at the same time, we all tend to overthink something, and when you're faced with a list of questions that someone is about to ask you, it can start to feel like you're about to get interrogated, and you might start overthinking the subject, and then one thing leads to another, and then all of a sudden you're refusing to answer a question that might have been basic and not that big of a deal just because you overthought it, okay? But when you're also talking about bigger names, bigger celebrities, athletes, movie stars, directors, whatever, they might just be sensitive about some topics, right? And so you should be aware that they're sensitive about those topics and not submit your list of questions if you plan to bring up any of those topics in advance. The second reason is not everyone is a media professional, right? So all of you are training to be able to answer questions and do ad lib at the drop of a hat. But chances are you're not interviewing somebody that's going to be a media professional. And if they are not, for example, if you're interviewing an athlete or a scientist or a researcher or a doctor or whatever, any other profession, they might get worried about answering the questions and they might start rehearsing their answers. And that is the worst. And the reason why that's the worst is because then the responses are going to be very practiced, and it comes across in the interview. You can tell that they have practiced answering your questions, right? So if you are interviewing someone and they are adamant that they want to know what you're going to ask them, you can send them the list of questions, but prepare yourself for the fact that they might have rehearsed answers. Or you can say, well, I don't have a concrete list of questions just yet, but here's a list of topics we'll talk about. And that is a really great alternative, and here is why. If you submit a list of topics, right, without knowing concretely what questions you might be asking about those topics, your guest is going to start thinking about those topics. First of all, they might think of things that they might not think of just off the top of their head during the interview. So it gives them some time to marinate on the subjects and come up with interesting factoids that they might not remember. It also gives them an opportunity to relieve some of their stress on their end without rehearsing the answers to your questions, right? Obviously, you want to write out a preparation of an introduction and a conclusion. Your introduction should include some context about your guest, what their name is, what they do, and why are they on your show, right? What makes them interesting enough to bring in to interview. And then a conclusion. And in the conclusion, you should include something like if your guest has any social media handles that they might want people to follow. If your guest has any upcoming events that they might want to plug, that kind of information should go into a conclusion. Also, in your conclusion, you can say things like, we'll see you next week, or tune in next week for an interview with someone else, or tune in next week for something else, right? So think things through in terms of an introduction and a conclusion before you interview your guest. And it's okay to have little note cards no bigger than your phone. And it's okay to have your phone, if you'd like to, have a guide of questions. But since we're doing everything via webcam, and if you're using your computer's webcam, if you just have a list of questions or your intro and conclusion written out in front of you, that's okay. What you want to try and avoid is sounding rehearsed yourself. So try and make sure that your questions and answers also seem like they were ad-libbed, like you just came up with what to say. And then you want to prepare your questions. Now, it's okay to not have an exact list of questions. You should have some questions to start off your interview. If you want to free-form your interview after that and you want to just see what answers you get, that's fine. But you should at least prepare 5 questions to begin with. And it's also good to include questions that will help you move the interview along if there are awkward silences. So sometimes we'll ask a question and our question will be rather elaborate, and then we'll get a monosyllabic yes or no answer, right? And you want to avoid asking yes or no questions, but sometimes you might not be asking a yes and no question. You might be asking a question that is, intended to have an elaborate answer. And then you might not get an elaborate answer because your interviewee just choked up, or your interviewee is, just not a person that uses a lot of words. And that's okay. But you should have follow-up questions to try and suss out a more thorough answer, right? Don't be caught off guard with a monosyllabic answer, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? Make the guest feel at home, okay? You do not want to make your guest feel like they are walking into a hostile environment, even if you become known for being a hostile interviewer. And I'll touch on that towards the end. You want to establish the guest's credentials at the beginning, right? So why is this guest on your show? Why is your audience being subjected to this interview? You want to reestablish the name and credentials periodically. Like, for example, if you have a longer video that goes on for 15 minutes and you include commercial breaks into your interview, you want to include the name and credentials when you come back from a break, okay? Remember that your guest is the star and your guest is the expert, okay? So if you are interviewing someone who is an expert in pandemic diseases, and they say something, it is not a good idea to try and contradict them on air or catch them in a inconsistency or catch them in something that is incorrect. And the reason for that, if it's not obvious, is because it diminishes their stardom in front of your audience, right? You kind of look like a jerk by correcting someone that is the, foremost expert in their field, potentially. And then also, if they are the foremost expert in their field and you caught them in an inconsistency, how possibly, smart are they? How much of an expert are they? And so that's something to keep in mind. So remember, your guest is the star and your guest is the expert, okay? And you want to give your guests the topic or subjects, but you don't want them to over-rehearse or over-prepare. And what you also want to do is try and avoid entrapment. So earlier I was setting you guys up with this whole Carol Baskin idea of getting Carol Baskin to come onto your show to talk and then asking her, well, how many pounds of meat does a tiger eat in a given day or in a given week? Well, how strong is a tiger's jaw? Like what's the toughest thing a tiger could bite through? And sort of, innocently lead to the suspicion that maybe she really did feed her husband to the tigers, right? You don't want to do that because that's entrapment. And then what that does is it creates a hostile environment for your guest, okay? So unless you are literally Barbara Walters, I don't recommend entrapping your guests, okay? If they don't want to admit something, they're not going to. And, sad to say, if it means bold-faced lying on camera, they might. So I really strongly suggest avoiding entrapment by leading your guest to an opportunity to say something. And if they choose not to say it, having a gracious way of changing the topic or moving past it without making a big deal or making it feel like you were hoping for a reveal that never happened. And then some basic do's and don'ts. Okay, so I'm not going to go super in depth because this is a 2-part list, but I do want you guys to, keep these things in mind. So you want to discuss a topic, but you don't want to interrogate your guest. You want to create a non-threatening atmosphere. Basically, it's really easy for an interview to shift in dynamic from being a lazy couch interview that seems kind of fun to all of a sudden feeling like you're being interrogated by a police officer, right? Many of you have probably gone on a date that really quickly went from a fun first date to an interrogation. And if you can internalize the feelings that you experienced from going on a date like that, or if you've never been on a date like that, but you've made a casual joke or comment in front of your parents or guardians and then ended up getting a lecture out of it, and you felt like you were being interrogated over something very, basic and simple that you said, that's the feeling that your guests can experience if you are not careful with how you deliver your questions, right? So you want to make sure that you're not like getting all investigative reporter like, what, and so did you or did you not end up feeding your husband to the tigers, right? You don't want to do that. You want to listen to your guest and you want to have proper reactions, right? So really listen and hear what your guest is saying. You don't want to be so ready to ask your next question that you miss their answer, because what they say might potentially lead to a more interesting discussion and a more interesting question, follow-up question, than what you have prepared next, right? It means that you should know the questions that you're going to ask, right? You should internalize the questions that you're going to ask, but be prepared to segue away from them if something more interesting comes along, okay? You want to make sure that your questions are based on the previous responses, right? Because a lot of times what students tend to do is have a golden list of questions and stick to those questions. And what happens is your guest might say something and I might want to hear more on that topic, but the interviewer has bounced on to the next question. The next question is completely unrelated to what was just said. And then as a result, we might double back and you might ask the follow-up question, but by then the flow of the conversation has been disjointed. And really, that's the most important part of an interview, is you want it to be a conversation. You want your guest to feel like they're just talking to you about something that they feel passionate about, and see how that goes, okay? It's good to try and build to a high point in your interview, which means, following your abstraction ladder, if you start with a broader topic and then you slowly build towards a point, then you're building towards a higher point. You're building towards a topic that is more specific or more concise, or something that you really want to deliver to your audience, right? You want to avoid referring to off-camera conversations, and that's because you don't want your audience to feel like they are missing out on something or being left out. Now, a cool thing to note, because this book that we are basing these lectures off of was written before the advent of social media, really, is you can have an off-camera conversation before your interview. Like, for example, if you and your guest are talking before you start recording the interview, and you decide to have your conversation publicly on Instagram Live, and then you do your official interview afterwards, then that actually teases for your audience, the topics that you might talk about, or the dynamic between you and your guest. And maybe people who wouldn't have tuned in before might tune in for your interview now. But traditionally, if I was like Jimmy Kimmel and I had a guest coming onto my show, I wouldn't want to refer to things that we talked about in the green room before the show started, because to the audience, it's unfair. It's something that there's no chance I will ever have of hearing, right? You want to seek out the deep convictions of your guest. I mean, to the best of your abilities, right? Not every single interview is always going to talk about, your guest's primal goals and drives. It'll probably not build to that, right? So, don't artificially seek out convictions of guests just to say that you checked that off of your list, right? If it doesn't feel right in your interview. But it is something that you should set as a goal of wanting to give your audience something they didn't know before, right? Don't interrupt with meaningless comments. A lot of students do the educated nod and then go, oh, yeah, yeah, oh, wow, okay, And you think what you're doing is you're indicating that you're listening to your guest, but in reality, what you're doing is just distracting your audience with meaningless comments. So it is better to have an educated nod silently, to smile, to look at your guest while they're talking to indicate that you are listening, to have activated body language that is open and facing and directing your guest. But what you don't want to do is make a bunch of extra noise, okay? You want to emphasize important answers. So if your guest says something important, shocking, or anything really that you want to highlight, you can repeat what they just said. Okay, so just to clarify, I just want to make sure that our audience really hears this. What you are saying is that you did not, in fact, feed your husband to the tigers, right? You take the last thing that they said and you rephrase it to your audience to really emphasize the point. You want to try and remain calm, okay? Sometimes it might be hard. Your guest might get antagonistic if they feel like you're asking questions on a topic that they're not comfortable discussing. But it is important that you remain calm, okay? And again, if you are at all curious what it means to remain calm, I do recommend checking out, oh my gosh, it's so embarrassing because I'm recording this and I should have looked it up in advance, but the interview with the musician who was in trouble for having relations with underage girls. And then he got into an interviewer's face and started screaming and had like a little mini tantrum. I will find the video and I will post it for you guys to see. But that interviewer was the epitome of staying calm and keeping cool and keeping in control of the interview. And when I say keeping in control of an interview, a lot of what I mean is not, that your guest is going to start being unruly and you somehow have to, bring them back. But sometimes our guests really like to talk. And if you're interviewing them about a topic that they're passionate about, they can talk for a long, long time. So you need to know how to interrupt politely, and redirect your guest back to the topics that you want to talk about, to the questions that you have for them, rather than have them just talk on and on for 5 minutes without any direction from you at all, right? You want to try and, as best as you can, make logical and smooth transitions. You want to be ready with the next question, but not so ready that you don't respond to something that your guest just said. Don't ask more than one question at a time. Don't ask yes or no questions. You should ask layperson questions and questions that a layperson wouldn't think of. And this comes back to our dual audience, right? So again, remember, you have an audience that is your audience, that are people who are watching your show because it's you. And then you're going to have some audience members that tune in because they are fans of the person who you are interviewing. So my favorite example on this topic is interviewing Elon Musk, okay? So you have a show where you interview local Bay Area celebrities, and people in the Bay Area love your show, and people in the Bay Area tune in to watch your show every week. You have Elon Musk on your show. Elon Musk has about as many fanboys as Steve Jobs did at peak Steve Jobs, right? So a lot of Elon Musk's fans are going to tune in to watch your show for this one episode. This is an opportunity for you to develop new fans that might start tuning into your show more regularly. This is an opportunity for your fans to become fans of Elon Musk and follow what Elon Musk does more regularly. And so how do you service both groups of fans? Because the Elon Musk fans are going to know everything that Elon Musk has ever said and done. And your Bay Area fans might not necessarily know that much about Elon Musk. So how do you service both groups? Well, you ask layperson questions that your Bay Area fans might want to ask if they got a chance to ask Elon Musk something. But you also want to develop some questions that Elon Musk's fans might want to ask. That they're going to be slightly next level questions, more complicated questions that assume that you already have some knowledge and context about who Elon Musk is and what Elon Musk does. Okay, so you want to make sure that you are doing both. okay? You want to avoid predictable questions. So, you're not going to want to ask Donald Trump who Donald Trump is going to vote for in the November election, because the answer is pretty obvious, right? And it's just lip service. And you don't want to answer your own questions. So you don't want to do is say, well, I think we know that the answer to this question is pretty obvious, but I feel like I should still ask it. Who do you think you are going to vote for in the November election, President Donald Trump? And he's going to say, well, I'm going to vote for me, of course, because everybody votes for themselves, right? And so you don't want to ask that question. It doesn't service either one of your groups of fans, right? You want to pause after a guest answers to give your audience a second to process their answer before you start asking the next question. Okay? It's a beat. It's not a long pause. It's just one beat. That's enough time. Okay? And you should interrupt your guest if they start to speak in jargon or in speak. Okay? So again, with Elon Musk, if you asked him a question about Tesla or SpaceX or Starlink or whatever, he might start giving you a response that involves a lot of jargon from within his industry. And not everybody might necessarily understand the difference between all of the different types of rocket boosters that SpaceX has developed. And so it is your responsibility, if your guest doesn't do it themselves, to interrupt your guest and say, okay, well, I just want to spell out for the people at home that when you say the Dragon booster, what you mean is, and then define what it is, right? Or maybe you don't know the answer, and that's okay. It's okay to interrupt your guest and say, I'm sorry, could you clarify for our guests at home and for myself, when you say X, what do you mean, right? And then that also gives your guest an understanding of how much they need to spell out some of the information they want to talk about, okay? If you're doing a TV show interview, it's okay for you to check your notes openly. If you're going to be on TV when you're conducting an interview, you want to make sure that you are aware of your posture and your facial expressions. So as I mentioned before, just make sure that you have open and physically engaged posture and that your face is open and that you're looking at the person that is talking. You only need to address the camera at the very beginning and the very end, but the rest of the time you should look at your guest and focus on them. You should always offer for your guests to finish with their own thoughts. Even if you feel like you've gone over your time limit a little bit, it's okay to say, okay, well, we're going to move on to commercial break, but before we go, are there any last thoughts that you wanted to add? Or is there a show that you want everybody to tune into? Or, is there anything that you want to plug, right? Think of how you want to phrase that to your guest. And different types of guests and different types of shows, you're going to want to use different vernacular. And then when it comes time to close out, you can say, thank you so much for being on our show today. Are there any final thoughts that you wanted to add? Is there anything you want to leave our audience with today? And they will probably say something like, yeah, absolutely. I would love for everybody to tune into our charity concert at the end of the blah, 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 blah. And you say, okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. And then you turn to the camera and you say, that's all the time we have for today. Please stay tuned for blah, 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 blah. Or be sure to check in with us next week when we interview blah, 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 blah. Or whatever it is that you want to say, okay? But here is my biggest pet peeve, and this is so important, and I cannot even begin to explain to you how many times it's underlined in the book. Do not end your interview with, well, that's all. Well, it looks like we're running out of time, or that's all the time we have for today, folks. Because your guests don't care how much time you're supposed to have. They want the full interview. And when you say something like, that's all the time we have, or it looks like we're running out of time, it makes your guest feel like you mismanaged your time. It makes your audience feel like you mismanaged your time. And then both of them feel like there could have been a longer video or a longer interview if you had managed your time better. And isn't usually your fault. You usually manage yourself and your time fine. Your guest went on and on for 5 minutes about something irrelevant, and now you're out of time because that's how much time you were allotted, right? Well, if you don't say that you're running out of time, nobody knows that you're running out of time, which is why you should practice saying things like, thank you so much for being on our show today, or we appreciate your time, or we appreciate your presence on our show. Find a different way to say that this is the end of the show, okay? And then make sure that you always thank your guests warmly and briefly. And that is it for our lecture on media, or on conducting interviews. And I hope that this has been helpful to all of you. And let me know if you have any questions via email.